Okay, let me welcome you back to the PIIRS Directors Book Forum. So this is a series of lectures that we have over the course of the year where we highlight recent books by Princeton faculty working in the area of international and regional studies. We've had several of them over the course of the year. We'll have a couple of more still left this spring. Today we have Helen Milner to talk about her recently published book, Votes, Vetoes, and International Trade Agreements, published together with written together with Edward Mansfield. So Helen is the BC Forbes Professor of Politics and International Affairs here at Princeton. She directs the Niehaus Center for Globalization and Governance as well at the Woodrow Wilson School. She was chair of the politics department, my boss, for a number of years. And in fact was instrumental in hiring me. She's written extensively on issues of international political economy, on the connections between domestic politics and foreign policy, globalization and regionalization, and the relationship between democracy and trade policy. Just to cite a few of her books, she published a book, Resisting Protectionism, in 1988, Interests, Institutions, in Information, Domestic Politics and International Relations, published in 1997, The Political Economy of Economic Regionalism, which she co-edited also with Edward Mansfield in 1997, Internationalization and Domestic Politics, which she co-edited with Bob Keohane. So it's our pleasure to hear about her most recent work today, Votes, Vetoes, and International Trade Agreements. Helen.
Thanks, Mark. Well, it's a pleasure to be here, and thank you all for coming. I want to talk a bit about the book, but try and set it in kind of a larger context for what's happening in the international trading system. The key point that I kind of want to make is that the international trading system is changing, and it's changing very fast. And in part, this is because the world economy, I think, is changing very, very fast as well. And I think many of you have probably understand some of this. The rise of China and other developing countries, as I'm going to show you in a minute, is having a big impact. This is combined with a few other things. As some of you know, the international trading system is sort of governed by the international institution, the World Trade Organization, the WTO, which was formed in the wake of the GATT agreements a number of years ago. And that institution is a large institution, a multilateral institution that has brought together virtually all the countries of the world. And it's had a series of rounds of negotiations since the end of World War II to lower trade barriers. Those have been very successful. Unfortunately, this last round that was launched a number of years ago, the Doha round, has stalled. And countries have been able to come to an agreement on how to move ahead with international trade negotiations. And so that failure and that stalling of that agreement is part of the changes, I think, that we're seeing going on. Another force that's changing is the way in which production is organized globally. And we've seen multinational corporations have been around for a long time, but the patterns in which they produce and trade have changed dramatically. And increasingly, multinationals are producing in different locations across the globe and then shipping their products all over and using global trade as well as these different production networks to fashion these very, very large global networks that I think are having a major impact on the way the world economy is organized. This is a chart that I think right away you can sort of see what's going on in the world. So the bottom line is China, and the green line on top is other developing countries. And what you can see is that from about 1990 on, there's a divergence that's really starting with the United States being less and less important in world trade. If you add the China numbers right here, which is now about 10% of world trade, to the rest of the developing world, that's 35% of world trade is now the developing world. And as you can see, the U.S. is down now to around 10% of world trade from a very dominant position earlier on. So this is just part of kind of what's going on. What I also want to show you is that these trade agreements that I'm going to talk about are not just things that nobody cares about and you don't hear about. This was the front page of the Financial Times about a month ago, talking about the big US-EU trade agreement that people are talking about. This is the New York Times front page about a month ago, also talking about that trade agreement. This is the Wall Street Journal front page talking about that trade agreement. So while in your daily life trade may not seem to be all that important to you, it actually is really important, and it occupies now, I think, front page news in many of the papers. So in terms of the world economy, again, trade accounts for about 60% of world GDP. For the average country in the world, trade is roughly equal to its gross domestic product. So for most countries, not the United States, where trade is only about 30% of gross domestic product, but for most countries in the world, trade is an enormous aspect of their country and of that world economy. Trade is also a major engine of growth in the world economy, perhaps the major engine of growth these days. We think that trade brings, in a sense, capital to poor countries. It fosters innovation by bringing in new products and forcing companies to compete and upgrade their skills and their products. And it also leads, we believe, to much higher levels of productivity in different economies. This is just showing you in graphs what's been happening to, again, world trade as a percentage of world GDP. What you'll see up there, that the dip at the top, that's the global recession depression. It had a very big impact on trade, and trade is only now beginning to recover. Again, this is trade as an average for all countries of their GDP. Again, what you've been seeing is it's growing from 50% to 100% roughly over the last 50 years, a very dramatic increase for most countries. This is, again, change in growth. The blue line is change in exports, and the red line is change in GDP. And this is just to make the point that this slide probably makes a little bit better, which is that average export growth, that is growth of trade, has been well above growth of average GDP. And this is since 2000. The previous graph you'll see is since 1970. So in terms of growth, in terms of major engines of growth in the world economy, trade has been a key one. International trade agreements, they're one aspect of these big changes that are going on. As I mentioned, the big multilateral global governance structure, the WTO, has stalled. And in the wake of that stalling, countries have been signing these trade agreements with each other. And many of you probably have heard of these. The European Union is one of them, and all the different aspects of the European Union, EFTA, and a number of its agreements with other developing countries, NAFTA, the United States, Canada, and Mexico, Mercosur, ASEAN, the South Africa Development Corporation, and the new one, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which is now on the other side for the United States, the Pacific side. The U.S. is trying to organize a trade agreement with many of the Asian countries. These agreements are not multilateral. That is, they don't include all the countries in the world, and they're often exclusive in that only certain countries are asked to be in them. They're mutual in the sense that countries reciprocally agree to open up their markets to each other. They're not just one side opening its markets. And they're not just regional. So there's some like the U.S.-Israeli Free Trade Agreement, which obviously spans a number of different regions. These agreements are a good thing because they lower trade barriers across the world, and they especially lower them between the partners to the agreement. They're not such a good thing because they allow discrimination. And that means that countries that are not parties to these agreements do not benefit from these agreements. Which makes them, in a way, able to discriminate against these outside countries. So these agreements, these trade agreements are important because they're a form of international cooperation. and they're allowing countries to liberalize their, not only their trade, but also other aspects, their property rights and investment, and to regulate their disputes, their economic disputes. And they've helped resist protectionism in the wake of the financial crisis and the stalling of the WTO round. And this has been, I think, a very important aspect of these agreements in the last 10 or 15 years, that they've been able to keep cooperation moving forward, and that they've been able to allow countries to resist kind of protectionist pressures that might have grown in the wake of especially this last financial crisis. What do we know about these agreements? We know that they seem to be associated with a variety of things that we like. One is that they're associated with less conflict among the countries that are involved in the agreements. We know that they're also associated with countries that grow faster and that trade more with each other. And they seem to be highly associated with helping countries protect their human rights, as well as protect the environment. And in these areas, the trade agreements have been used as a form of linkage and a form of kind of threat, so that when countries try and violate their human rights or do things to the environment that might affect other countries, countries have sort of invoked the trade agreements as a mechanism for threatening other countries and pushing them back from doing these things. And they're also related to democracy, and I'm going to talk about this a little bit more because it's related to what we argue in the book. So these agreements take off. There were agreements all throughout the post-Second World War period. There was a period in the 1960s where developing countries signed a lot of these things, but really what happens is in the early 1990s, these agreements take off. And now there's some, about 500 of these agreements have been signed. Some have been, are defunct in the sense that they've been incorporated into other agreements. So there are roughly about 350 of these in force now, where a number of years ago there were very, very few. Almost every country, I think, in the world, I think the latest was that only Mongolia didn't have one of these agreements. And most countries have multiple agreements, and 13 is the average for each country. They cover a lot of issues beyond trade. They cover things like foreign investment. They often cover some issues related to the environment. They cover labor standards. They've gotten very long and very detailed. And they're a major way for countries to, in a sense, regulate a variety of different issues. And a variety of different economic issues where they might have disputes. This has made people worry, especially in the WTO, as you can imagine, which used to be the main sort of center for governing trade, worry about what these agreements are doing and what they signal. And people worry what they mean for world trade, what they mean for international cooperation, and what they mean for peace and conflict in the international system. And the real question is here, are these going to foster increasing trade and increasing growth and all globally around the world? Or are they going to foster the division of the world really into different blocks? Say an Asia bloc centered around China, an American bloc centered around the United States, and a European bloc centered around the EU. And in that configuration, are those blocks going to be sort of mutually hostile toward one another? And there's been concern about which direction these blocks are going to lead us. So this is just a graph, again, of the post-World War II period that shows you the number of countries in blue joining these agreements. And as you see, that number jumps very dramatically starting in the late 1980s. The red line is the number of these agreements that have been formed each year, and again, that number jumps in the late 80s, early 90s. And then the green line just shows you the cumulative number of these agreements that have grown over time, so that you can see again this dramatic change that's going on in the world economy. This is just to show you that over time, these agreements have moved from being very much regional agreements, like the European Union and NAFTA, to being cross-regional. And we've got a lot of these, which is the cross-regional ones are the ones in blue, which have especially grown lately. This is a map of the world that shows you these things have spread everywhere. Those in yellow are the ones with more than 20 of these agreements. The ones in kind of red are 10 to 19 of these agreements, and then all the way to Mongolia up there with no agreements, being the only country that has, in a sense, resisted this. And these, again, are sort of this average number of participants, the average number of agreements that each country is in. And what you can see is not only are countries signing these things, but they're signing multiple ones of these agreements. And this is just to show you that this has happened all over the world. It's not just a European phenomenon, although Europe has been very involved in it. So why are countries signing these agreements? And while it's been a widespread trend, this trend has had variation in it. So some countries started signing these earlier than other countries. Not all countries have signed a lot of them, and some countries have signed a lot of them. And the question we wanted to ask was, what leads countries to be interested in signing these agreements? And what are the forces that are driving countries toward these things? And how can we explain, in a sense, this variance? And if you think about it, every year there's something like 100, well, let's say on average there are about 200 countries in the world. And those 200 countries could have signed an agreement, each one with every other country, which would lead us to something like 20,000 different agreements. We don't have anywhere near 20,000 different agreements. So again, the world is not saturated with these agreements, but there are still about 350 of them, and we want to explain, in a sense, why we're seeing this pattern developing. A lot of people, when you talk about these agreements, the first thing they say is, well, it must be the economic gains. Countries are signing these because they think they're going to get lots of economic gains from them, more trade, more growth, all of those kinds of things. And if you read most of the economics literature on this, this is the main thing that the economists talk about. What are the economic gains that countries are going to get? The problem is, if you actually look at these agreements, as the economists have done, what you notice is that there are some gains, there is more trade, but it's not clear that there are a lot of gains for these countries from signing these agreements. And it seems kind of odd, because for many of these agreements there's a lot of contestation around signing these agreements. And the question is, why would political leaders be willing to put up with a lot of kind of contest over these things if they're not bringing in that many economic gains? And in terms of just the United States, the ratification of these trade agreements, of NAFTA, of the Caribbean and Central American agreements, have been some of the most contentious bills in the Senate that have been voted on in recent years. TAFTA passed the Senate by 1 vote. It's really rare for any bill to pass the Senate by that small of a majority. And it was very contentious. The recent South Korean-U.S. free trade agreement was also very contentious as well. So the question is, why are political leaders, in a sense, pushing for these things? In a sense, why is Obama now pushing for both the Trans-Pacific Partnership and the EU partnership when he knows he's going to face a lot of political contest over this, especially if it's not clear that the gains economically are going to be that great? The argument we want to make in the book is that it's very much about politics, and it's about the political aspect of these agreements that leaders are interested in. Some of the other arguments that people have put forward that we're going to also look at are things about economic rivalry, that countries sign these agreements because they fear that other countries are signing them. And they want to, in a sense, get on board. And you can think of this, again, in terms of the Trans-Pacific Partnership that the United States is now proposing, includes everybody in the Asia region except China. You know, it's sort of, it may be obvious what's going on there in the case of the U.S. trying to kind of line up a series of allies with this agreement. There's, again, political rivalry as well, which is worrisome because if you have these blocks that form and that exclude other countries and that are directed against other countries, again, you worry that this kind of discrimination is going to lead and intensify rivalry in the world economy rather than subdue it as it has in the past. There are domestic reasons for these agreements as well. In particular, what people focus on is how multinational firms see these agreements. And again, as I mentioned, one of the big changes that we've seen in global production is these global production networks that multinationals have devised, where they're producing parts of a good into all sorts of different countries, and they ship the good around until it is finally assembled, and then they ship that final product all around the world. And many of you have probably seen the iPhone YouTube story where the iPhone, the 500 different parts of the iPhone, they're made in 500 different countries, and then they're assembled and the iPhones are shipped all over the world. And this is the kind of production network that you're seeing with many, many firms. When firms have that kind of a production network, they're very worried about protecting their ability to move those products all over the world very freely and without a lot of trade barriers. And so the argument that people have made is that these agreements are foisted on countries by these multinationals and the pressure that multinationals are putting on governments to do this, to protect these networks. Our argument is slightly different, in part because we find that many leaders in countries are not being pressed to do these things. They're choosing to do them. And they're choosing to do them, we think, because they allow leaders to, in a sense, send signals to their publics to reassure their publics and multinationals and other groups within those publics, basically that these political leaders are, in a sense, competent leaders, that they're running the economy in a good way, and that they're doing things that aren't, in a sense, allowing special interest groups to get protection and therefore raise prices and, in a sense, hurt general consumers. And that political leaders want these agreements to reassure these publics about their behavior so that in bad economic times, they can point to these agreements and they can sort of say, look, I've signed these agreements, I've tied my hands, I can't give in to protectionist special interests that want me to do things for them, and I'm doing good things for the economy by doing this, and therefore, even if it's a bad time, you shouldn't vote against me because I've really done these things and the bad time is not my fault. And we think, in a sense, that these agreements send signals to the public that leaders aren't giving in to special interests and aren't responsible for some of the bad times that hit their economies. And so that's the kind of argument that we're offering about this. What we think is that if this argument is true, then leaders that are more subject to electoral pressures, that is, leaders in democracies, are going to be more likely to sign these agreements. Again, it's political leaders wanting to reassure their publics, and they're wanting to do this because they want to win re-election. And in winning re-election, that's one of their main goals. And in competitive political systems like democracies, these pressures are going to be much more strongly felt by leaders than in systems in which leaders are not replaced by publics and not through elections. So the main argument of our book is that the more competitive political systems are and the more democratic they are, the more likely you are to see leaders turning to these types of agreements. And again, in the case of the US-EU agreement, one of the reasons that Obama has talked about for signing this is, again, he wants, he believes it's going to improve economic growth in the United States, but he also, I think, is trying to signal that he's not giving in a way to special interest groups and other pressure groups that may want him to close the economy and protect the U.S. economy, and that would put enormous costs on the U.S. economy that otherwise he might be able to avoid. The problem is that these agreements, as I said, are politically contentious often. And there are groups that do want protectionism, and that do want to be shielded from the international economy and that don't want to have to compete with imports. And they lobby very often very hard in both Congress and the executive branch for protection. And in democracies, these groups have access to political leaders through the Congress and the legislature that can allow them to, in a sense, try and stop the president from making these agreements if he wants. We call these groups usually veto players, in the sense that they're groups that are opposed to these agreements, and they have regularized access to the political process so that they can block any kind of change, and usually this is through legislatures. This isn't just in the United States, this is pretty much all over the globe. And we think that the more of these groups you have, the more of these veto players you have in a country, the more likely it is that the executive is going to be unable to make these agreements and pass these agreements through their legislatures, or get, in a sense, the groups that they need to agree to sign these. So our main arguments are going to be about democracy, more democratic countries being more willing to sign these agreements, and about countries that have more veto players, on the other hand, being less able to sign these agreements. And we're going to use these two factors to explain, in a sense, the variance in who signs and who doesn't. We're going to try and control for a lot of other factors that we think matter in all of this, and I'll talk a bit about those in a minute. But I'll skip sort of some of this stuff because it's kind of the more technical stuff. We run lots of these regressions controlling for many, many things, looking at who signs these agreements. But this is just to show you a chart of what happens when we run these models and we look at the impact of being more democratic. So on the bottom here, you have from a very autocratic regime to a very democratic regime, and here is the probability that you ratify one of these trade agreements. And what we see is that controlling for everything else in the model, where countries are, whether they have disputes with each other, whether they have alliances with each other, a whole variety of things, that it's a positive relationship, that as countries become more democratic, or for countries that are more democratic, they're much more likely to sign these agreements. On the other hand, for these veto players, the argument is directly opposite. As countries have more and more veto groups in them, they're less and less likely to sign these agreements. And that's, again, holding constant all these other factors that may be affecting the kind of willingness to sign these agreements. It's very hard to establish kind of a causal relationship in these types of models that we have. And we know that all sorts of things are related to one another. And so what we tried to do is to devise a series of other kind of arguments and hypotheses about, if our argument was right, what should we see out there? And we came up with about 6 of these. And one of the things that we thought was part of the follow-on from our story was that democratic governments that sign these agreements, and that sign more of them, should last longer. Since our agreement is that when democratic governments sign these things, publics are reassured, and when bad times hit, they are less likely to vote these leaders out of office, because they sort of understand that the bad times aren't so much due to what the leaders are doing. The leaders are pretty competent, but it's just bad times that occurred for other reasons. We also think that, in a sense, left-wing governments versus right-wing governments are more likely to sign these things, because publics are likely to think that left-wing governments are more likely to be protectionist, and therefore the left-wing governments will see this as a way, in a sense, of binding themselves and reassuring publics more strongly than perhaps for right-wing governments. We also think that democracies that are more exposed to international trade are going to be more likely to sign these. Again, because trade is a very important aspect of their economies. These agreements are going to have a bigger impact on those economies, and it's going to make these leaders more likely to sign them. We think that, again, much like with democracies where there's more political competition, within countries that aren't democratic but have a bit more competition, they're going to be more likely to sign them, again for the reasons that leaders are going to have more tenuous kind of hold over office, and so more political competition is going to make them more eager to sign. And we think that the more democratic a country is, the deeper the level of integration that these agreements are going to lead to. And finally, that the more veto players you have, the shallower that these agreements are going to be. And we have an argument about delay, because veto players, again, are going to mean that the executive has a much harder time passing these agreements. And will have to spend a lot more time working on getting a coalition in favor of their agreement. In the book, we go through all of these different kind of arguments, and we try and provide evidence in favor or against these arguments. And we find a pretty substantial amount of evidence that supports most of these. We think that kind of allows us to better sort of pin down that it's our argument about why democratic leaders are doing this, rather than some other argument about why countries might be signing these agreements. The other factors that affect these agreements, so in looking through this argument, we also try and control for a variety of other things that we think might influence why countries are doing this. So one of the things that matters is geography. And it matters curiously because it goes in two opposite directions. Countries that are very far apart tend not to sign these things. And you can well imagine, Venezuela is unlikely to sign one of these with Uganda, right? They're far apart, they don't trade a lot, they don't have a lot of foreign relations. On the other hand, you would think that contiguity, that is being right, Brazil and Argentina having a contiguous border, would be very likely to sign these things. And we actually find that being too close, being contiguous, often means you don't sign these things, and that's usually because you're involved in some kind of dispute. Most countries in the world have disputes with their neighbors of some sort, and they're less likely to sign these agreements in part because of those disputes. Again, a variety of economic factors are important for explaining these things. Richer countries sign these things more. Countries that trade more sign these things more. These all seem to be pretty obvious kind of arguments. It's nice to find them in the data. One thing we recently found was that overall, when countries are not growing well, they tend to sign these things. But for democracies, downturns really help them, encourage them to sign them more. And we think this is part of, again, sort of shows part of our argument that in bad times, democratic leaders become desperate for these types of agreements to, again, reassure publics that these bad times aren't due to their incompetence and their willingness to give in to special interests. And again, you can see both the Trans-Pacific Partnership that Obama's proposing, as well as the European partnership he's proposing, as being part of this pattern of democratic countries trying in kind of bad economic times to reassure publics that they're trying to do something and that they're not really responsible for the kind of economic downturn that's going on. We also find that contagion from neighbors is important, and the question there is whether it's kind of political rivalry or economic rivalry that drives these. Other factors, allies are more likely to sign these things, but countries that were once colonies with one another are not. And an interesting one is that many people argue that these things are rich northern countries pressing poor southern countries into trade agreements that benefit the rich northern countries. That's not at all what we find. In fact, we find very clear evidence that these are more likely to be signed between countries that are roughly equal rather than between countries that are very disparate in their kind of power. And one reason we think that this is true is that the smaller or poorer countries understand very well that these can be sources of influence, and they don't want to sign these things with much stronger and more powerful countries because they are means of exercising influence, and countries are sensitive to this. We also find that a variety of things affect, in terms of the global system, again, declining American hegemony seems to have pushed many of these things forward, and the end of the Cold War seems to have pushed many of these things forward. So let me just conclude by saying that the argument we're making really is that politics matters for these international economic agreements. That these international economic agreements then really matter for what the world economy looks like and for what world politics is likely to look like. And so that domestic politics is a very important element of what's going to go on in the world economy and what we think of what's going to go on in world politics. And again, these domestic political aspects, both democracy and veto players, are very important. Finally, should we be worried about these agreements? And here I think it's hard to tell at this point. Some of these agreements we think have been very helpful, and they've helped the world economy resist kind of a protectionist surge that might have occurred in the wake of the financial crisis. They've been an engine for spurring foreign investment especially into developing countries, and they've been a means of increasing trade among countries and, in a sense, helping to reduce kind of conflicts and disputes. On the other hand, if they keep going on and if they're used by countries, in a sense, to build blocks that exclude other countries and that are directed against other countries, they could well become a mechanism for increasing conflict in the world economy and for fragmenting the very larger global economy that we have now. And so there is a concern that the kind of discrimination that these agreements exercise and the kind of leverage that they can bring to bear, both on members inside the agreement and on members and on non-members outside the agreement, could have detrimental effects. And they may be replacing the multilateral system that we have of governance, the World Trade Organization. And that could be a good thing and it could be a bad thing. And it'll be very interesting to see how the WTO, which is trying to deal with these things and trying to regularize them and bring them into its orbit now, how it deals with them and whether it's able to actually kind of subsume all these agreements or whether these agreements, in a sense, push the WTO aside. So with that, let me stop. Thank you. Bob?
That was a great talk, Helen. I wanted to bring you back to the 1930s, early 40s, because the last period when there was a lot of trade discrimination was the 1930s. There's a powerful literature of political economy that comes at that issue. Eugene Staley, especially, but also here for many years, and Herbert Weiss, and they came with a strong conclusion, which is that trade blocs lead to war. I think they even put it in that stark fact. And they looked at especially the U.S.-Japanese war, and they saw it directly related to the discriminatory trade arrangement against Japan in the 1930s. And I'm wondering, I have two questions, both about this kind of issue. My first question is, do you think that how serious is that danger in your view? One view is we're going to repeat the past and it's terrible. The other is other things are so different about the modern world that we don't have to worry about that too much. And you sort of raised the issue but didn't really come down on it. I'm interested in how you think about that. And the other is Albert Hirschman, who was at Princeton for many years, died in the last year, who wrote about the influence effect of foreign trade. And Hirschman was studying the discriminatory foreign trade in the Nazi trade bloc, especially before World War II. And he was the first person, I think, to point out that asymmetrical foreign trade, a very powerful state and a very weak state in this case, for example, Nazi Germany and Bulgaria, would make the weak state in effect the satellite of the big one because they couldn't afford to move independently. And you're saying that that lesson has been learned. So in a sense, the weak states have learned from Hirschman. We have a testimony to Albert Hirschman's work because now the weak states shy away from these agreements, maybe because they understand that it's going to have this effect.
Yeah. No, so, great questions. I mean, on the trade blocs lead to war issue, I think things are a bit different than the 1930s. And I think there are at least two or three things that are different. One are these global production networks that the multinationals now have. And the fact that these multinationals are not just from the United States anymore, or not just from Europe. Many of these multinationals now are coming out of the developing world. And they're sort of knitting the globe together in these production patterns. And there isn't sort of a country or a set of countries that are excluded as enemies. It's not like in the Cold War even, where you have kind of East versus West. You've got this one global economy where you've got an enormous amount of, say, you know, take China, which you could say, right, that's the other side. Well, I think 70% of China's exports are from Western multinationals based in China. So it's a, you know, to block China in a sense would be to block your own exports and to ruin your own multinationals from the West. So that's very different. The other thing that's different is that China itself is deeply integrated into the world economy, just like the United States is. So both trade, foreign investment, China's capital flows, all of these things are deeply integrated into this world economy that is tied, you know, directly into the United States and into the European Union. And so again, it's very hard to break these things apart. I think the third element that's kind of interesting that goes to the second point about this influence effect is, note that countries have signed on average 13 of these things. And you might say to yourself, why are you signing so many of these things? Well, they're signing them with lots of different partners because they don't want to be dependent. And what is happening is when a country signs with the United States, usually its next move is to sign with the European Union. And then the next move is to try and, you know, see what China's up to, and if China will talk to them about some agreement. And so it's, again, the countries don't want to be locked into one kind of country that they're sort of dominated by. And the Latin Americans, I guess, are a great example because in the 1930s, these blocs, Latin America was just tightly integrated into the American economy. And while Latin America has globalized more now than it was in that interwar period, it's not as locked into the U.S. economy as it was. It's now heavily, it's both Europe and China are playing big roles in Latin American economies these days. It's not just the United States, and these agreements have helped in part to deal with some of that. So I think I think the world is more complicated and quite a bit different, and I think it's going to be harder to kind of form these blocs because countries all over the world are sort of so dependent, and because multinationals have sort of knitted this world economy together so deeply in a way. Yeah.
That is, there are real business interests behind the rise of the PTAs, but it somehow seems that the highly mobile capital of the multinationals is less likely to be coded discursively, at least, as a special interest in the way that labor was in the 20th century America or that manufacturing was in the 19th. So do you think like a vocabulary of special interest could develop to encompass the multinational? Or?
Yeah, I mean, so in one of the earlier slides, there is actually a group of people who do code the multinationals and kind of their free trade interests as an interest group. And they argue that that interest group is driving these kind of agreements. We think that they're important in these agreements, that if you didn't have that interest group, you would be less likely to have these types of agreements. But that they're not the only thing that's driving them. And political leaders, in a sense that there are now sort of two sides to this, and it's easier for them in a way to avoid being captured by protectionists. And you could say, well, then they're captured by these free trade interests. There's part of the story is probably about that as well. Although some of these agreements, it's very hard to even see, like the U.S.-Jordan, it's very hard to see what you know, U.S. multinationals as being really, really interested in the Jordanian market. And again, I mean, there are a variety of different reasons for those types of agreements. Christina?
I love this book. It's really great bringing together all the theories we have on trade agreements, and it's like peeling an onion where you go through every implication to show support for the argument. I have a question, though, about 2 points. One is, given that you've shown that the consensus is they're actually not worth very much in economic benefits, why is this an effective signal to voters? What is the logic of the preferences of voters that treats these agreements as being so important? Especially if you were to think of it as the PTA versus more commitment to the WTO. That said, the second question is, you sort of suggested that failures of the WTO were causing the PTAs, but the graph of the signing of PTAs shows the surge is starting in 1990, and if anything, is starting to level off by the time the Doha round is failing to meet expectations. And do you attribute the Cold War effect as more about unleashing democracy, or why is it that it's the early 90s that starts this dramatic increase in PTAs?
Yeah, so the first question, so one argument that could be made is that political leaders do these things because they think they're going to get huge economic benefits from them, and that's going to keep them sort of in office for longer. We don't think it's actually that, because many people don't see these huge economic benefits from these things. We think it's more of a signal, again, about a leader's competence and his intentions, and again, sort of giving into special interests that want protectionism, which is likely to sort of slow the economy down. So again, it's a slightly different argument than the one that relies on economic gains from these agreements, because again, we just don't see those gains there. And again, if you look at leadership duration, which is one of the things we do, and you put in economic factors and you put in signing these agreements, both of those things have an effect. So it's not as if it's just through the economic channel that leaders are, in a sense, benefiting from these agreements. So we think it's more this story about, in a sense, reassurance and signaling. Why the early 1990s? I think there are a whole series of things going on, and the Cold War, the end of the Cold War being one of them. And clearly, you know, my answer to Bob, I mean, it's sort of the breakup of the blocks and the creation of this, you know, one world, as people have called it, that I think starts pushing countries toward this, and then a lot more countries become democratic. And that also leads to some of the pressures for these agreements. I think the WTO, right? You know, '94 is sort of when you know, the WTO starts, and you start having problems right away with the Doha round, and people seeing that it's going to be very different this time, because while it's called a development round, the developing countries aren't always on board. And so, and the interesting thing is, we find the WTO to be a positive influence on these agreements. If you're a member, you're more likely to sign these things. And in some ways, we think that's an indication that these countries are looking for alternatives to the WTO, kind of knowing that it's likely to have stalled. So I think it's kind of a complicated story about what's going on. So you had a question in back?
Yeah, could you give some more insight around the failure of the Doha agreements? Was it an idea before its time, or was it not relevant, or were the participants agreeing to something in Doha, knowing full well that when they went back, they were going to crack the arm?
Yeah.
Can you give some more insight on that?
Yeah, so my take on the problem with the Doha round is that the issues, it's not just about trade anymore, right? There are a whole series of issues about investment, about property rights, about dispute settlement. They're a very complicated set of issues that affect countries' policies in a lot of different areas. And so the package has become much more complicated to negotiate over time. Plus, it used to be that the US and the Americans could sort of agree on a package, and then everybody else got pressured to follow along. The problem is the US and the Europeans, as that one graph I showed you, they're no longer kind of super dominant in the world economy. You've now got the Chinese, you've got other developing countries, you've got Brazil, you've got India, and they have a whole series of different interests. And it's much harder to make an agreement when you've got 20 important countries rather than, say, 2. And you're seeing this in all sorts of realms, right? This is the same problem for the environmental agreements and climate change agreements. It's not just that you have 2 countries anymore that tend to dominate, it's that you've got at least 20 countries, if not more. And so it becomes very hard to have an agreement, and then you add the fact that there are all these different issues where countries have all these different positions, and it becomes really, really complicated, I think. Again, for some of these domestic political reasons. So I don't know, I don't have much hope about the Doha round succeeding, unfortunately. And I think that's probably too bad. And then it raises the whole question of what happens to the WTO in the future. So, yeah.
I have one specific question, which is like, how do you quantify the number of veto players for your in those blocks?
Yeah, so we use, I can actually, let me go back. We use this measure that somebody else has actually designed, this one here. And what they've done is they've looked across the world over time, and they've asked, in a sense, this question of what groups can block the executive from sort of making a law or changing a policy. And in democratic countries, the answer to that is to look at the legislature and to see how many parties there are in the legislature, which is more veto players, and then whether the majority coalition is the same as the president's or the prime minister's coalition, or whether it's different, and then how much it differs. And so for every step in that, for more parties, parties different from the executives, the number of veto players increases. So this isn't a measure specific to trade, it's really specific to each country and each year, and it focuses on parties and the legislature and differences from the executive.
How do you deal with autocratic countries versus non-democratic countries, or is that not part of that?
Most autocracies have legislatures, and so they look at some of those things, but they're all very close to zero, the autocracies. So this measure varies substantially with the democracy measure, but within democracies it varies quite significantly. So you get a lot of variance within the democracies.
I have two minor comments on that. With increasing democracies, right, throughout the world, do you see a trend in multi-party or is there an increase in the number of veto players, at least recently? Many new democracies, they start out maybe with 2 parties, but then you see that they fragment, at least in the last 10 years. That's anecdotal, I don't have numbers. And then the other anecdotal thing that I have a comment on is that you said that in times of downturns, the number of PTAs are increased, right? Could this be simply a quick bandage type fix that that leaders seek to stay in power? Anecdotally, I think most of the leaders outside the Western world, they are very astute politically, but I don't think they understand long-term economic implications. That's my anecdotal observation. And in a situation where they are faced with some with a troubling election coming up, they tend to think multinational group might bring them some kind of economic boost, which would help them win the next election, but not something that they think about very deeply.
Yeah. I mean, in terms of veto players, I don't think there's any single trend, at least over the longer period we've looked at. I haven't looked at the last 10 or 15 years. It might be interesting to do that. In terms of our findings, though, we actually find that, in these downturns, countries do sort of try and turn to this, especially democracies, and we think that's kind of part of the argument that leaders are looking for, in a sense, a way of reassuring these publics, especially in those downturns, because they know they're probably going to be punished electorally.
So I'm just saying that they are not looking to re-evaluate the public, but rather they're thinking that there will be a sudden, if they sign one of these agreements, there would be a cash influx, and that will help them
Yeah.
politically.
Yeah. I mean, the data don't show that's happening, so that it might be what they think, but it's not what's happening. Money.
Thank you so much. So I have two questions. First is about this Cold War issue. And it strikes me that there might be a democratic transfer going on after the Cold War, so that what you're capturing is basically countries were naturally moving towards democracy anyhow, and after the Cold War, we were going to have these PTAs anyhow, and you're capturing this strong correlation. So my question is, did you do kind of like a regression discontinuity where you looked at countries before the Cold War, countries after the Cold War, and see how democracy was shaping those outcomes that way? So it just seems that a lot of this is being driven by Cold War, the post-Cold War period. The second part of my question is a lot of your theories, they demand on the demand side that countries are seeking the PTAs, but very little has been said about the supply side of the PTAs. And in other words, is the U.S., is China, is Europe willing to have these PTAs with smaller countries? So when you look at the dyads, I was wondering if you like kind of clustered them around north-north relations, north-south relations, and south-south relations, and whether you find similar trends.
So the Cold War one, we did, break the sample up in the periods, and I don't remember it changing the results at all. So I think you still find some of this, even in the earlier Cold War, in the Cold War period, you find the democracies are more likely to sign these agreements. We also ran these systemic models, which just look at the number of agreements that are being signed per year relative to the number of democracies in the world that year, relative to whether you're in the Cold War or not in the Cold War. And there again, we find really strong evidence that holding whether you're in the Cold War or not constant, the more democracies in any year, the more of these agreements you're going to sign. So it seems as if you can sort of disentangle the Cold War and the democracy effect. But it's clear that after the end of the Cold War, these things are taking off. But I think, again, as I said, I think there are other reasons in addition to sort of the democracy angle. But clearly, they are clearly related to one another. The supply side, so again, what we're doing here is really looking at each country and asking for each country, what are they, how does ratification occur for each country? So in a sense, we're looking at both the demand and supply side. So the US has to negotiate with the EU, right? And in the models, one observation is the US that year and one observation is the EU that year. So that is sort of getting it at both sides. And it's not, these negotiations occur just between the countries. It's not like they're occurring with some third party. So I don't know whether that answers your question, but we're looking at it in effect at both sides, both parties to the agreement separately, and asking about their individual characteristics and then their relations with other countries in the sample, in a sense. Yeah?
My question has two parts. The first part, could there be a different causal mechanism at play in democracies versus authoritarian regimes? So, for example, in democracies, it's signaling to the public, but in authoritarian regimes, it's signaling to your economic friend or to your potential competitor. So that's one piece. And the second piece of the question, how do you think the relationship between state and market impacts these PTAs? So a country like China, that's very state-led capitalism, large state-owned sectors within the economy, do you think they're more or less likely to sign PTAs, or does your study even speak to that?
Yeah, so different signals in autocracies and democracies. Our view of many autocracies is that they're heavily dominated by groups that are protectionist, in part because they're state-owned, and in part because they tend, because they're state-owned, not to be terribly competitive on world markets. And so in these autocracies, one of the reasons why you're not seeing autocrats doing this stuff is they have these support coalitions that are made up of these state-owned enterprises and the workers in state-owned enterprises, and none of them are eager for openness. And the autocrat does not want to disturb that support coalition, and so you're not getting the kind of pressure you are in a democracy for kind of this, sending this signal of reassurance. In terms of state-owned, we looked at the communist countries, and we tried to do a little bit on state ownership of the industry. We didn't find too much. Again, the problem is that there's a huge overlap between state ownership and autocracy. And so it's very hard to separate those two things out. And rightly so, because I think autocrats own part of the economy so they can build support and keep control over things. And so it's very difficult to separate those two out. Paul?
Did I understand you correctly that in your earlier part you said that weak and strong states don't form have agreements? Because, I mean, you gave an example of Nazi Germany, which I didn't think was very helpful. And I think, I just think of one I know best was NAFTA. Mexico's not weak, but it lacks industrialization, and it offers a cheap market. I mean, there's a kind of isn't there a complementarity motivation in a number of these trade agreements between economic weakness and economic strength?
Yeah, so it's clear that some of these agreements do pair countries that are not, of equal kind of capacity. But the interesting thing is that on average, when you look at these agreements, they're more likely to actually occur between countries that are roughly equal. So while you can find instances where there is this inequality, you also find a lot of instances where there aren't. And I mean, I guess many of the European agreements, now we sort of look at Europe and we say, oh, well, yeah, there's this weak southern tier and there's this strong northern tier. But it hasn't always been the case. I mean, Italy is the third largest economy in the EU, and Spain is, I don't know, fourth or something. So it's, while we now think of them as weak, when you actually sort of look at them, they actually look like it's pretty equal among those countries. And if you look at some of the agreements in Africa, many of those countries are very kind of complementary to one another in terms of being roughly similarly sized. So, again, we kind of think that countries are not unaware of the kind of influence dimensions that these might bring, and that some countries choose to do that. The Canadians and the Mexicans obviously did. I don't think, I don't know if the Canadians regret it. The Mexicans may regret it, but they didn't have to, it's probably better for them than not having it, I think, in some ways, economically at least. James?
My question goes off the point that Professor Davis raised, and I wonder if the mechanism behind this is that leaders are actually responsive to public opinion and looking at public support for free trade, or if they're just trying to look busy. Whether or not, Obama's looking at public opinion polls and thinking, the American people really want free trade, or if it's, the State of the Union address is coming up soon, not to say I did something right. Which mechanism is really at play here? I guess the only way you could test that would be to see whether or not the number of agreements a country signs in any given year is correlated with varying levels of public opinion towards free trade.
Yeah, I mean, and that's something that we haven't done, and that would be pretty hard to do because countries aren't sort of doing public opinion polls every year when they're signing these things. I guess the one thing that makes us kind of think that it's not just sort of looking busy is that these things do seem to have an effect on longevity of leaders in office. So if it was just busy work, I'm not sure that would translate into this effect. So we think it does have some kind of real impact on leaders' ability to stay in office. Again, you can debate exactly the causal pathway for that. We sort of thought that by teasing out all these different kind of mechanisms and hypotheses that we could narrow it down to what we were trying to argue. Mark?
Yeah, I mean, do leaders actually say, look, I passed NAFTA and therefore you should reelect me, or I'm negotiating the Pacific Trade Agreement and therefore you should reelect me? Because I'm just wondering, because whether this is as salient an issue as you're kind of making it out to be. You do find this correlation between whether they're reelected or their longevity in power and whether they actually engage in it. I mean, one alternative explanation of that might be that leaders that feel more comfortable in their power and are less, I mean, in fact, you're kind of finding that with your veto points, that they're more likely to, that is that they're less subject to being challenged in their power, are more likely to engage in these because I don't really see this as an issue that people are actually actively going out and campaigning and whipping up public support around. But the other question I'd like you to answer is why Mongolia, which you threw out there. I mean, as you may or may not know, Mongolia actually has had a major economic boom in the last years.
with
I mean,
minerals.
It is the hot spot. I know lots of people
Yeah.
who were moving from Russia and from Eastern Europe to Mongolia because it was really developing, and yet they are steadfast in not engaging. So tell what was
Why
happening
Mongolia?
in Mongolia?
The public support agreement. So I'm not sure that, you know, we've really found leaders going out there and saying, oh, you know, vote for me because I signed Mercosur. But on the other hand, when political leaders talk about their record in the context of campaigns, they often mention these things, and especially outside the United States. Again, we sort of collected up a lot of public opinion evidence of what publics in, say, Latin America and Africa and Europe think of these agreements. And on balance, you know, 60 or 70% are in favor of them. And leaders do, when they're talking about their records, do mention what they're doing in terms of these agreements. Now, you see a lot of, you know, in Europe and Britain, right, you see a lot of, like, let's get out of the EU kind of discussions and things like that. And so there obviously are forces that don't like these agreements. But it seems as if leaders aren't hiding these things. And certainly the fact that Obama's got all this stuff on the front page when he's a Democrat and, right, Labor's not enthusiastic about these agreements suggests that something is going on about him.
Who would vote for Obama because of these agreements?
Well, it's interesting that the largest car exporter in the United States is BMW. The largest car exporter in the United States is not GM, is not Ford, is not Chrysler, it is BMW, a German firm. BMW produces in South Carolina. South Carolina is not a natural state for Obama support. I would bet that he'll get more support. Well, he can't run again, but I would bet that he would have gotten more support from South Carolina after this agreement, if it goes through, than he would have otherwise. So, you know.
So it's tied with the specific interests that seem to benefit precisely from those agreements.
Well, I mean, that's the clearest way I can pinpoint it. I mean, I would think that it's less, because it's less tied to these economic benefits, I think at the end of the day, what he would hope for is that he could appeal to people and basically say, look, I signed this agreement, it's really good for the American economy, it's gonna do good things, and, you know, I'm a competent leader because I signed this and made this agreement, and, you know, you should vote for me because I'm a good, competent leader. And I'm not giving in to, you know, narrow labor interests that want protectionism, or the footwear industry that wants protectionism, or these other kinds of things. And why Mongolia? I don't know. I think they're actually in the midst of negotiating an agreement now with somebody. I think they've caught on too. But yeah, you know,
they're
they're
not the most autocratic, and they're
no. No, yeah, I don't know. It's like an interesting puzzle.
Could I take a slightly different tack? Not necessarily using it to get elected, but rather using it to change the dialogue on unpopular domestic issues. And I'm reminded of Richard Nixon's rapprochement with China, almost at the height of the time that Watergate was bubbling up, and, you know, nuclear agreements with Russia, and et cetera, but I don't know what Obama's objective is, but he's got a lot of issues that need attention. So signing trade agreements could be a way of changing the dialogue away from the unpopular domestic to this other abstract thing that no one can really
Yeah, although, I mean, the interesting thing is, I think that there are groups within the Democratic kind of, support coalition that don't like these agreements, and that he is running a risk, again, of, in a sense, annoying them, to appeal to what he thinks is a much larger audience that looks at this as a sign of competence and a sign of good leadership. And I think that's the gamble that he's kind of taking in these agreements. And he's also hoping it does help the American economy. I don't think he thinks it's going to hurt it. But his exact motivations, I don't know. I mean, we'll have to see when he leaves office, right, and hopefully writes about this, and we can kind of understand better why he's doing these things.
Well, thanks. This has been a fascinating discussion. It seems like a great book. I hope you'll all go out and read it if you haven't read it already. And thanks a lot.
Thanks, Mark.